I'm a storyteller, so I thought I would switch it up and tell you some stories about some of my experiences doing this messy, mucky, complicated work of bridging divides in the 21st century. But I'll start. So, the name of this is Embodying Brave Space, Stories from the People. Over the past 2.5 years, I have been helping co-lead a project called the People's Supper, which has brought people together over shared meals to have conversation across lines of difference. But I'm going to start on a journey. I-40 stretches from the coastal plains of North Carolina to the deserts of California, through what I call the Southland, the place where Midwest nice meets Southern hospitality to evoke a particular type of warmth that sometimes can glaze over a deep history of economic exploitation and racial animus that animates in the very soil and histories of that land. If you're driving down I-40 from my home in Nashville, Tennessee, to Little Rock, Arkansas, around exit 257, you'll find my roots in Hughes, Arkansas. In January of 1931, that's where my Granny Vera was born. Like so many women of her generation, African-American women of her generation, she escaped the racial terrorism of the Jim and Jane Crow South in search of a better life. She found herself on the south side of Chicago, where my dad was born, and where I spent my summers growing up. And it was around my granny's kitchen table that I learned a little something about life. Over competitive games of spades and bid whist, people drinking brown liquor in little glasses. This was not the praying part of my family. And fish fries, I learned my story and history, what it meant to come from a long lineage of Black women who had seen the best and worst of what America has to offer. I was driving through Hughes, Arkansas in November of 2016, 1 week after the presidential election here in the United States. And I don't know about you, but on that fateful night, I collapsed on my kitchen floor. I rocked back and forth and I said to myself, I don't feel safe, I don't feel safe, I don't feel safe. And then I heard Granny Vera's voice in the back of my mind saying, baby, we ain't never been safe. And it was a reminder that for me, as someone embodied as I am with brown skin and as a woman, there are just some places and some things that are not made for me. So I started to identify that emotion that I was feeling in my gut as I was driving down that road as grief. And you see, it was the same grief that I felt when I talked to my friends back home in Quincy, Illinois, population 40,000, 95% white, the people I grew up with, who voted very differently from me in that last election cycle, whose grief was being expressed with the shutting down of factory jobs that their grandfather and fathers had had, and they didn't know which way to turn. And so on that drive down I-40, I called my friend Lennon, who runs an organization called The Dinner Party that does work around grief, primarily with 20 and 30-somethings who are the first in their cohort to experience death loss. And I said to Lennon, what would it look like if we took your dinner party idea and expanded that definition of grief to our nation? And we pulled in our friend Emily and launched what would become a project called 100 Days, 100 Dinners. For the first 100 days of this presidential administration, we invited people with a simple invitation. Come to supper. Get to know one another. Our hypothesis was that relationships do indeed move at the speed of trust. And social change, the type of change that we want to see, moves at the speed of relationships. And so we started hosting these suppers. We ended up doing 115 in that first 100 days. And what was amazing is, as people were writing into us, they started to share a little bit about their stories. I'm a Minnesota-born African-American Muslim woman serving as an Army physician who is just returning from deployment in Iraq. I've been asked if I was a terrorist when the cable man in liberal California saw my Quran on the shelf. Despite the challenges, I love my life and I'm eternally grateful for the opportunities and experiences I have been afforded. Though a triple minority in this country, I have been privileged. I love my identity. In my 79 years, I've seen a lot of changes in the relationships between people of color, LGBT people, and the sexes in the workplace. The changes need to continue, and I need to grow to enable changes within me. I'm a WASP, an old lady, but I've learned from my children as they went out into the world. I'm from a small rural community, and most of my family members are Republican. Many voted for Trump. I have been working on having these conversations with them, but would also like to make an impact on my own community. Unfortunately, my social circle in Chicago is made up of like-minded people. And so while I'd love to host a potluck, I don't know who I would invite or where I would start. These are the people's stories. These are reflections of our stories. And so when we set out to do this 100 Days, 100 Dinners project, we set out to do two things. The first was create bridges and opportunities for people to engage across lines of difference. Difference broadly conceived. Because one of the first things I learned when I hosted a supper with my liberal friends in Nashville, Tennessee, which may sound like an oxymoron, I realize people don't know that Nashville's actually a very blue liberal bubble and a big sea of red, is that there was as much distinction between us as there might have been with someone who voted differently among us. So we sought out to create these bridging spaces across lines of race, generation, identity, political ideology, and because sometimes it is not ethical to bridge or ask people to bridge. And I'll say that one more time. Sometimes, given our current society's conditions, it is unethical to ask some people to bridge when they are fighting for their lives. Because it is sometimes unethical to ask certain people to bridge, because sometimes there is an undue burden put on certain people and certain bodies to represent all the people who inhabit those bodies. We wanted to also make sure that we created healing spaces. Spaces for communities that were in need of personal fortification, who were in need of just spaces to be and ask questions like, where does it hurt? Where do you go when your cup is empty? And so, since January 20th, 2017, we've hosted 1,400 suppers in 138 cities and towns across the United States. And what I think a more important data point is, we've heard from people in over 700 cities and towns across the United States. And I think what that speaks to is a deep desire to go beneath the headlines and find a place of deep human connection again, to be able to see one another again, not based solely on our party affiliation or how we might look or be judged by how we look when we enter a space, but for the particularities of our stories and our nuance, for the Granny Veras in our life. And one of the elements that we found is so important to doing that work across the dinner table. Some people ask me, why dinner? Because it's an ancient practice and you gotta eat. Truly, it's one of the first ways that we learned how to be with other people is by sharing a meal. But creating the container, particularly when we start to wade into these uncomfortable spaces, requires us not just to set our intentions, because I think many of us come in with good intentions when we want to have these bridging conversations, but it also requires us to be brave. And so over those 1,400 suppers that have taken place nationwide, there have been two things that have united all of them. The menus have been really different. We've had potlucks that were 5 people, up to our largest supper was 500 people in Los Angeles. Have been these two pieces, which I want to share with you as an asset and resource. You can download them for free at thepeoplesupper.org. The first is a poem written by my colleague Mickey Scott Bay-Jones called An Invitation to Brave Space. The work of bridging, when you're ready for it, requires us to find and summon a sense of courage within ourselves. It is far easier for us to stay with people who think and look just like us. And so what Mickey invites us to do is be brave, because in the words of this poem, which I will read in a second, for some of us, there is no such thing as a safe space. And so it reads, "Together we will create brave space, because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world, we all carry scars, and we have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. This space is not going to be perfect. I know you all are so happy this weekend. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side." And as I think about what our aspirations are for this American project that never quite has gotten fulfilled, perhaps it's an invitation to be brave, to test out what it means, recognizing that we all come to this work with different levels of risk. But if we're going to live into a vision of what it means to live in a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy, what? Where people's votes count? I live in Tennessee, y'all. The attack on the right of people to vote is very real and present. Then perhaps the first step is inviting and thinking about what it would look like in each and every one of our lives to embody brave space. For us to become the inhabitants of brave space and carry it wherever we may go. Because what we found, particularly in this bridging work across lines of political difference, is the number one thing that prevents people from coming to the table is a fear of being labeled and judged. Fascinating. I mean, the 3 organizations that co-founded the People's Supper, we have a particular politic. It tends to be left of center. I'm going to be transparent, right? Transparency is important. But the number one fear that folks who were conservative articulated was the fear of being called a racist, or being called sexist, or being assumed to be fill in the blank, or someone would try to convert them in a particular way when they sat down at the table. And I wondered, as we began these projects, what it would look like for them to lean into brave spaces in their own community. And we found that the number one indicator of whether or not people show up to a People's Supper that involves bridging is knowing somebody else in the room. And I think it's easy for us to think that we don't have those networks of difference. But I guarantee you, if you think about your Thanksgiving table, there are a few folk in that space, perhaps. or maybe not your current Thanksgiving table, but your Thanksgiving table growing up. There are a few folk in that community who you know who think real differently than you. What would it look like to invite them into brave space? Finally, I'll end with one final story. Last fall, we took on a project called the Midterm 5. At the peak of the 2018 midterm elections, we decided to host large-scale people suppers in purple places. Places like Creede, Colorado. I'm happy to report almost 70% of the population of Creede, which is around 400 people, showed up to our supper. And Charlotte, North Carolina. And Grand Rapids, Michigan. And Washington, D.C. We hosted our supper in Washington, D.C. on November 1st, 1 week after the shooting in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania at the Tree of Life Synagogue. We hosted our supper at the historic 6th and I Synagogue in Washington, D.C. And one of the participants there, who I'll call Jane, wrote in to us afterwards. You see, Jane is an active born-again Christian who came to the table that night, curious, but because her friend had invited her, prepared to buckle down and defend her beliefs. The surprise for Jane is we never actually asked people about their politics at these bridging suppers, although we can know from our data that it was about 50% Republican, 50% Democrat. We asked them questions like, describe a time recent or long since past when you were made to feel alone, isolated, or unwelcomed. And describe a time you were made to feel the opposite. And what was consistent is that it was easier for people to name that first category. But Jane, at that table and sharing her story of her father's loss of faith in his end days, connected with a rabbi I'll call Lori, who is sitting next to her, who is a self-defined, bleeding heart liberal, but had a moment of connection because she too had had an experience when her father was dying, of having conversations about the relevancy of life and death and whether or not there was a God. And suddenly, there were the conditions of possibility for brave space, for connection that otherwise would not have occurred. And I love that story because I think at a time where it is easy to be pessimistic, radical optimism and hope may actually be the less cynical and more courageous choice. And I'm not saying that in a Pollyanna-ish fashion, because I realize, trust me, I've done a lot of these suppers, people I don't like, that it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of investment. It takes examining and looking at ourselves, deciding whether or not we're built for the work, whether we're ready for the work, whether it is actually okay for us and where we're at in our journey to do it. And then take a step out and make an invitation. So, because poetry is a theme today, I'll leave you with the words of the great bard of Harlem, Langston Hughes, who said, "Oh, I say it plain, America was never America for me, but this oath I swear, America will be." See you at supper.